The wind didn't blow that night. It howled. It came screaming down from the black spine of the Cimarron Mountains like a wounded animal, tearing through the cottonwood trees, rattling every shutter on every building in the town of Harlan's Crossing, New Mexico territory, as if the night itself was desperate to warn someone about what was coming. Elias Kane wasn't a man who spooked easily. 38 years of frontier living had ground most of the fear out of him the way weather grinds sandstone. Slowly, completely, without apology. He'd survived a drought that took his cattle, a war that took his brother, a grief so quiet and so total that it had simply become the air inside his house. But when his dogs wouldn't stop barking at 2 in the morning, something deep behind his ribs told him to get up. He pulled on his boots. He grabbed the lantern. He walked out into a world made entirely of ice and darkness, and he pushed open the barn door. The lantern light found her immediately. She was collapsed in the hay beside his old roan mare. A young woman, dark-haired, dressed in a torn calico dress soaked through with blood and half-frozen mud. Her lips were the pale blue of a winter sky just before a storm closes in entirely. But her eyes were open, and they were fierce. She grabbed his wrist with a grip that stunned him, and through teeth that barely parted, she whispered 4 words that would set the entire territory on fire. Don't let them in. You need to understand something about Elias Kane before you understand anything else about this story. He was not a legend, not a gunfighter, not a man with a shadowy past or a chest full of military medals gathering dust on a shelf. He was simply a man, sunburned, callous-handed, and stubborn in the particular way that frontier men get stubborn when they've decided that the land beneath their boots is worth more than their own comfort. 6 years ago, he had bought 40 acres of high desert rangeland outside Harlan's Crossing with money earned breaking army mules. The land pressed up against the base of a long red rock ridge that burned amber at sunrise and deep violet at dusk. Beautiful in the way that hard things are beautiful, the way a hawk in a dive is beautiful, or the first green shoot pushing through cracked, thirsty earth. He had a modest house, 2 rooms, a stone fireplace and a porch that leaned slightly left, as if tired. He had a solid barn, because a man who neglects his barn doesn't deserve to be called a rancher. He had 23 head of cattle, 2 horses, a border collie named Amos, and a red hound called Ezra who had proven useless at everything except, apparently, detecting serious trouble in the dead of night. He had no wife, no children. On the mantel sat a single photograph of a woman named Clara, taken on their wedding day in Abilene in 1876. Clara had died of fever in the spring of '79, 3 days after losing the baby that would have been their first child. Elias had not courted another woman since, not from dramatic resolve, but because grief, for certain men, calcifies around the heart so slowly that by the time they notice it's there, it has already become bone. He existed, efficiently, quietly, stubbornly, on the edge of that empty land, and Harlan's Crossing left him alone, which suited him entirely. Now, Harlan's Crossing was the kind of town with ambitions beyond its station. A main street, a general store, a livery, a church, a school with 17 children and 1 exhausted teacher, 3 saloons, a hotel, and a sheriff's office that was far too large for the one man who occupied it. Douglas Pratt, who wore his badge like a crown and moved through town like he'd invented the concept of authority. But the man who actually ran Harlan's Crossing was Fletcher Holt. Holt held no official title. He didn't need one. He owned the largest ranch in the county, the Crossed H, 12,000 acres of prime grazing land, and he owned the Harlan's Crossing Savings and Loan, which meant he held the notes on half the mortgages in the territory, including several belonging to men who worked for the sheriff. He was 47, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, and possessed of a particular charm that felt warm. Right up until you realized it was the warmth of someone else's fire, and that he'd burn whatever he chose without asking your permission. His wife, Miriam, had died 2 years prior, riding accident. The town had accepted that story the way small towns always accept stories they're afraid to question, without looking too closely, without asking too loudly. 6 weeks before that frozen November night, a young woman had arrived on the westbound stage from Santa Fe. She said her name was Rose Calloway. She carried one leather bag and wore a deep green traveling dress finer than anything Harlan's Crossing had seen step off a stage in recent memory. Within 48 hours, she had secured a position as bookkeeper at the Savings and Loan. Fletcher Holt had hired her himself. The town noticed, the way small towns notice everything, with sidelong glances and whispered conversations over dry goods counters. Some said she was too pretty to be a bookkeeper. Some said Holt was finally getting over his grief. The saloon owner said she had quiet eyes, and quiet-eyed women were either saints or storms. Nobody had yet looked closely enough to understand which she was. Nobody yet knew that Rose Calloway had not come to Harlan's Crossing for work. She had come because of a dead woman, and on the night of November the 14th, someone in that town had figured that out. Morning came gray and brittle over the Cimarron Ridge. Elias was already up before first light, frying salt pork on the iron skillet, telling himself he wasn't listening for movement from the front room where he'd installed Rose Calloway on his horsehair sofa with 3 blankets and a pillow stuffed with cattail down. He was, in fact, listening very carefully. At 7:30, she appeared in the kitchen doorway, wrapped in the top blanket, dark hair loose, a careful strip of cloth holding the wound at her hairline together. She looked better. Color had come back into her face, enough to confirm she intended to keep living. He set a plate in front of her without ceremony. She ate without speaking, the way people eat when they've been running on something other than food, on adrenaline and fear and sheer stubborn will. He poured coffee. He sat down across from her. "I need to know what I'm dealing with," he said. She studied him over the rim of her cup. "Knowing makes it your problem. You're in my house," he said simply. "It already is." A small thing moved across her face. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. She set the cup down, and she told him the truth. She had not come to Harlan's Crossing for work. She had come because of a letter, written by Miriam Holt, Fletcher's dead wife, mailed 6 weeks before the so-called riding accident. The letter had gone to a post office box in Santa Fe, registered to Rose's older sister, Eleanor, who had once worked as a seamstress at the cross-stage before leaving under circumstances no one in town discussed openly. The letter was 3 pages, written in a tight, frightened hand. It described, in precise detail, a systematic fraud. Fletcher Holt had been stealing mortgage payments from 12 local families, recording them as defaulted, then absorbing the properties into a shell company registered under a false name in the Arizona territory. 6 families had already lost their land. 3 had left the territory entirely. The remaining 3 were still in Harlan's Crossing, living on what they believed was a grace period from a generous man, not knowing that grace period was simply the time it was taking Holt to complete the paperwork to destroy them. Miriam had found out by doing the one thing her husband had never expected. She had opened the real ledger, the one hidden behind the false bottom of the cabinet in his private office, and she had understood immediately what she was looking at. She mailed the letter the next morning. 3 weeks later, she was dead. Eleanor had been too frightened to go to the law, understandably, since Sheriff Pratt held 3 mortgages at the Savings and Loan, so she had written to Rose instead. And Rose Calloway was not merely a woman with quiet eyes and a green traveling dress. She was a former court recorder from Santa Fe who had worked for a federal circuit judge and who understood, better than most, precisely what a fraudulent ledger meant as evidence, and precisely how much danger a person was in when the man whose crimes they could document also effectively owned the town around them. She'd gotten herself hired as bookkeeper to find the original ledger. She'd found it. She'd spent 3 weeks carefully copying its most damning entries into a small notebook hidden in the lining of her leather bag. Then, 4 nights ago, she'd gone back for the original itself. "Fletcher keeps it in his office," she said, voice perfectly steady. "I needed the original to bring to the federal marshal in Santa Fe. Copies mean nothing. His own hand in that ledger, that's what puts him in federal prison." "He was still there," Elias said. "His horse wasn't at the hitching post. I didn't know he'd been keeping it at the livery for a week." She touched the wound at her hairline, then stopped herself. "His men took my bag, my notes, everything." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire ticked softly. But they didn't bring you to the law, Elias said slowly. No, she said. They didn't. They both let the weight of that understanding sit between them. If Holt had taken her to Pratt, she'd have faced a trespassing charge and whatever story Holt chose to tell, and the real story would have been buried forever. Instead, they had beaten her and left her on the North Road in a blizzard, assuming the cold would finish what their hands had started. Elias stood. He moved to the basin, set down his plate, and stood there a moment with his back to her. Where is the original ledger now? He asked. His office, second drawer of the left cabinet. Under a false bottom. He turned around. He began pulling on his coat. Elias, the first time she'd used his name, stopped him. They will come here before noon. When they come, don't argue. Don't protect me. Just, I'll handle my own property, he said. Clear, calm, final. He walked out into the cold morning. And Rose Calloway stood in his doorway, holding her coffee cup in both hands, watching a stranger walk toward danger on her behalf, and felt, with a clarity that surprised her completely, that she was afraid for someone other than herself. She understood immediately that this was a new and entirely different kind of risk. Harlan's Crossing in the early morning was all boot heels on boardwalks and chimney smoke and the smell of fresh bread from the bakery and horses steaming in the cold outside the livery. It looked peaceful. It looked like 100 other frontier towns. It looked like a place where ordinary life happened, where children walked to school and men talked about cattle prices and the coming winter, and nobody thought too hard about what might be moving underneath the surface of all that ordinary. Elias rode Brigadier down the center of Main Street at 8 in the morning and felt every pair of eyes in town follow him with the particular attention a small town gives to someone who has arrived. At the wrong hour, carrying the wrong kind of quiet. Thomas Aldridge at the general store helped him find cartridges for his Winchester without comment, made change for a $5 note, and then, very quietly, without looking up, said, Heard Holt's men were riding north of town last night. That right, Elias said. Something about a missing woman, Thomas said, shifting a jar of peppercorns that didn't need moving. None of my business, naturally. Naturally, Elias said, and walked out. He could feel what Thomas wasn't saying, the warning dressed as neutrality, and underneath it, the clear limit of it. Thomas Aldridge had a mortgage at the savings and loan and 3 daughters to feed. He would offer warnings in the language of things left unsaid, because that was the most courage the world, as he understood it, would allow. Elias didn't blame him. He simply noted it and moved on. At the sheriff's office, Douglas Pratt had his boots on the desk and a dime novel in his hands. He looked up when Elias entered, and something crossed his face that was quick and practiced, the particular blankness of a man organizing a story before conversation starts. Elias kept it brief. He said he'd heard trouble on the North Road and wanted to report it. As a matter of record, Pratt watched him carefully. Fletcher Holt was in here first thing this morning, he said. Looking for a woman from his office. Says she took some important papers. He paused. He said if anyone finds her, they should come to him directly. Another pause. Not the law. The fire in the small office ticked. From outside came the sounds of an ordinary morning going about its business. That's an unusual request, Elias said. For a sheriff to accept. Pratt looked down at his dime novel. Yes, he said quietly. It is. There was something in that, thin as a crack in dry pavement, but real. Not defiance. Not courage yet. But a fissure. Elias filed it away and left. He went to the Silver King Saloon, because information in a frontier town moves more freely there than anywhere else. Dolores Vega, who had worked the Silver King for 11 years and had listened to more honest confessions than any priest in the territory, set a coffee in front of him before he asked for it. She alive? Dolores said, low and without preamble. Yes, Elias said. A breath left Dolores that she'd apparently been holding since before sunrise. I heard horses on the North Road last night, she said, wiping the bar. 3 of them, moving fast. She wiped a spot that didn't need wiping. Holt's foreman, Cord Rains, was in here yesterday afternoon, drinking heavy for a man who doesn't usually drink. Said something to Mickey Farrell about loose ends. She set the rag down. Whatever that woman knows, Elias, it has them genuinely scared. And scared men with power are the most dangerous kind. I know, Elias said. Then hear this, Holt went to Judge Carver at first light. Whatever legal machinery he can put in motion, search warrants, trespass orders, whatever story he's building, it'll be moving by mid-morning. She leaned slightly closer. She needs to be gone before noon, or she needs something strong enough to stop him in place. There's no middle ground. Elias thought about the original ledger sitting in its false bottom drawer 3 blocks away. There's no time to reach the federal marshal in Santa Fe, he said. No, Dolores agreed. Then we have to change the terms here, he said. He looked at her directly. Any chance you know Judge Carver's housekeeper well enough to have a private conversation? Dolores studied him for a long moment, really studied him, in the way she'd studied men in this saloon for 11 years, reading what lived behind their faces. Then the thin, sharp smile of a woman who has been waiting a long time for exactly the right question crossed her face. Sit down, rancher, she said. Let me tell you what I know about Judge Carver. And then let me tell you what I know about Cord Raines. And then let's talk about what happens tonight. Outside, the wind picked up. The ordinary morning of Harlan's Crossing went on, oblivious and unsuspecting, exactly the way ordinary things do, right up until they can't anymore. They came to his property at 10:30. Rose saw them first, 3 riders pushing hard up the north road, kicking up frost-dry spray from the frozen ground. She recognized Cord Raines in front. Big-shouldered, jaw like a hammer, eyes the flat gray of old iron. Behind him, 2 men she'd seen standing near Holt at the savings and loan, positioned the way weapons are positioned, close to someone who intends to use them. Elias was already on the porch. He stood with his hands at his sides, not on his rifle, not on the Colt at his hip, just standing the way a man stands on his own ground, unhurried, unintimidated, rooted in a way that said plainly, "This is mine, and you have not been invited." Cord Raines reined in 10 feet from the porch steps. "Kane," he said, "not a greeting, an identification." "Raines," Elias said, the same way. "You know why we're here." "I know what you're saying you're here for," Elias said. "What I'm less certain about is the actual reason." Raines shifted in his saddle, the movement of a man recalculating. He'd expected compliance or fear. He'd gotten neither. "We're looking for a woman. Rosalind Calloway. Worked for Mr. Holt. She took property that doesn't belong to her, and Mr. Holt wants it returned." "What property?" "That's not your concern. If you're asking to search my land," Elias said, "it is absolutely my concern. You got a warrant." Raines's jaw tightened. "Don't need one." "Interesting position," Elias said, and the patience in his voice was somehow more dangerous than anger would have been. "Because the territorial law I looked up this morning says a private citizen cannot enter another man's property without consent or a valid magistrate's warrant." He tilted his head. "You got consent?" "I'm asking for it," Raines said through teeth that barely parted. "And I'm declining," Elias said pleasantly. "Kindly remove yourself from my land." The 2 riders behind Raines shifted weight. Small movements, the kind horses and armed men make before something happens. Raines raised one hand, barely, and they stilled. "Mr. Holt is going to hear about this, Kane." "I expect so," Elias said. "You can also tell him I stopped at the sheriff's office this morning to file an incident report, and that I paid a call on Doc Harmon, who has recorded, in writing, dated and signed, a full description of the injuries I found on a person on my property last night." He watched Raines's face change. "And that I had a lengthy and productive conversation with Dolores Vega at the Silver King, who has provided a sworn written statement regarding certain things said by your foreman in her establishment 4 days ago." He let that settle into the cold air between them like a stone dropped into still water. Mr. Holt might want to consider that the situation has shifted somewhat since last night. The silence was complete. The wind had died entirely. Even the horses seemed to understand that something balanced on this moment. Raines looked at him for a long, cold, calculating time. Then something passed behind those iron eyes. Not retreat, not yet, but reconfiguration. A tactical withdrawal wearing the mask of indifference. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Elias agreed evenly. "It isn't." Rains wheeled his horse and the three riders went back through the gate without another word. Elias stood on the porch and watched them until they were a quarter-mile down the road. Then he went inside. Rose was in the hallway. She'd heard every word. Her face held relief and gratitude and something harder beneath both. The knowledge that a reprieve is not a resolution. "Doc Harmon and Dolores," she started. "Before I came back," he said. He hung his coat. "Dolores is the most dangerous person in Harlan's Crossing, and everyone's forgotten it because they're too busy being afraid of Fletcher Holt." "They'll come back tonight," Rose said. "More men." "Yes. And none of that stops the original ledger from sitting in that drawer." She sat at the kitchen table, moving carefully, like someone whose body was still relearning that it had survived. "Without the primary document, everything is circumstantial. Doc Harmon's notes prove I was hurt. Dolores's statement creates suspicion. But neither one proves the land fraud. Neither one puts Fletcher Holt in a federal prison." Elias sat across from her. Between them on the table he placed what he'd been working on in the barn that morning. A hand-drawn map of Harlan's Crossing Main Street, the savings and loan clearly marked in the center. Rose looked at it for a long moment. "That's going to get you killed," she said. "Possibly," he said. "Elias." She looked at him directly. "Why are you doing this? 2 days ago you had 40 acres and 23 cattle and a life that had nothing to do with any of this." He was quiet. He looked at the photograph on the mantel. 9 families, he said, lost their land because one man decided he was above what's owed to people. He smoothed the edge of the map with his thumb. "My father lost his farm to a falsified bank record when I was 11 years old. I watched him become smaller every year after that, until he stopped. I'm not in the business of watching that happen to people if there's something I can do about it." The fire crackled. The room was very still. Rose pulled the map toward her and said, "The east window has a weak latch. The alley behind the building is unlit after 9. She met his eyes. "And I know exactly where the ledger is. You'd be searching in the dark alone. You can barely stand," he said. "I can stand fine," she said, which was about 60% true. "You going alone is how this ends badly. We go together." He looked at her for a long moment. "Can you ride?" "I was raised on a horse," she said. He nodded once. "Midnight. Before rains brings reinforcements." He stood. "Eat something. Sleep if you can. I'll wake you at 11. He went to make dinner. Rose sat at the table with the map in front of her and realized her hands were perfectly steady. The fear was still there, but it had direction now. Purpose. A task on the other side of it. For the first time in 6 weeks, she knew exactly what she was going to do next. Midnight in Harlan's Crossing. The town had settled into its false late-night calm. Saloons down to their last drinkers, Main Street boardwalks empty, windows dark above the storefronts. Overhead the sky was savage with stars, cold and brilliant and entirely indifferent to whatever human trouble played out in the shadows below. They came in from the north, cutting across open ground, leaving the horses tied at a fence post behind the livery. Rose moved well, better than her injuries had any right to allow. She was running on the specific energy that comes to people who have been afraid too long and have finally chosen action over waiting. They reached the alley behind the savings and loan at 12 past midnight. The building was dark. The east window was exactly where Rose had said, and the latch was exactly as she'd described, warped by the season's temperature swings until it no longer seated in its frame. Elias worked it with a thin strip of strap metal for less than a minute before the window swung inward with a soft creak that, in the absolute silence of the midnight alley, sounded catastrophic. Both of them went completely still. 30 seconds. Nothing moved. No light. No footsteps. They went through the window. Inside, the building smelled of lamp oil and paper and the dry mineral scent of banknotes. The particular smell of money kept in small rooms, which always carries something of a cage about it. Rose moved ahead through the outer office, past the clerk's counter, down the rear corridor to the private offices. Fletcher Holt's office was at the end. The door was unlocked. Elias noted this. A man who doesn't lock his door believes either that no one dares enter, or that what he values most is secured another way. The false bottom drawer told him which. Rose went directly to the left cabinet. Second drawer. She pulled it fully open, pressed on the base panel in 2 precise spots. A soft click. The false bottom lifted, and there it was. The ledger. Brown calfskin binding. Thick with 4 years of careful, meticulous, damning arithmetic written in Fletcher Holt's own hand. Rose's fingers closed around it. And from the front of the building, unmistakable and devastating, came the sound of a key turning in a lock. Elias had Rose's arm in the same instant she heard it. Not dragging her, guiding her, back behind the office door, into the deep shadow beside the bookshelf. Both of them pressed motionless into the corner, the ledger against Rose's chest. The air between them held absolutely still. Footsteps on hardwood. One set, no two. Heavy boots. Moving through the outer office, through the gate. Down the corridor. The lamplight came first. A warm orange glow growing beneath the office door. Elias's hand found the grip of his Colt in the dark. He did not draw it. Not yet. The door opened. Fletcher Holt walked in alone. His guard had stopped at the corridor entrance. Holt moved to his desk with the unhurried confidence of a man retrieving something he expected to find exactly as he'd left it. He set the lamp down. He opened the left cabinet. Second drawer. Pressed the 4 spots on the false bottom. The silence that followed was different from all the silences before it. It was the silence of a man encountering the impossible. Holt straightened slowly. He turned around. The lamplight found them in the shadow beside the bookshelf. His face moved through several expressions very rapidly before settling into something cold and deliberate. The expression of a man who has never truly been challenged, encountering the first clear evidence that the world does not, in fact, arrange itself around his preferences. "Kane," he said. His voice was perfectly controlled. "I should have guessed." His eyes moved to Rose, and in that movement crossed something older and uglier than anger, the look of a man who has always believed that people like Rose Calloway exist to be erased. "You have something that belongs to me," he said to her. "No," Rose said, and her voice did not waver by a single degree. "I have evidence of what you took from 12 families in this territory. That belongs to them." Cord. The guard came fast through the door. What happened in the next 40 seconds would be told in Harlan's Crossing for 20 years afterward. Elias moved, not toward the men, but toward the lamp on the desk. He hit it deliberately, sending it skidding to the floor, the flame dying on impact, plunging the room into absolute darkness. In that darkness, Rose ran. She knew this office. 3 weeks of working in this building had mapped every corner into her memory without her even trying. She went for the south window she'd catalogued on her first day, the one facing the side alley that opened outward, and she went through it into the cold midnight air with the ledger crushed against her ribs. Elias remained in the dark long enough to hear Rains crash into the desk searching for him. Then he went through the office door, down the corridor, out the east window, and into the alley at a dead run. A gunshot split the night behind him. Then another, both wide. Rose was already at the fence post with both horses. She had Nell's reins extended before he reached her. They mounted in the same motion, horses already turning, already moving, and then they were riding north through dark open miles, the stars overhead wheeling, the frozen ground a blur beneath the horses, and behind them the lights of Harlan's Crossing blazing into sudden and furious life. But between them and whatever came next rode 20 miles of wide open country. And pressed against Rose Calloway's chest, for 12 stolen families, rode the ledger. The snow came again before dawn. Not dramatically, no howling wind this time, no screaming cold. Just a quiet, steady commitment of fine flakes drifting down through absolutely still air, covering the ground gently, making the world clean again with the indifferent mercy that only weather and time can offer. Elias and Rose made it back to the ranch with 20 minutes to spare before the first gray pre-dawn light gathered on the eastern ridge. They did not sleep. There was no time, and the particular alertness that follows a near thing doesn't release a person easily. Elias built the fire. Rose sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open before her, moving through its pages by lamplight, her expression growing heavier with each page turned. 9 families, she said quietly. I'd thought 6 had already lost their land. It's 9. 9, Elias repeated. 3 left the territory completely. She turned another page. One of them, Alonso Fuentes. Notation here says his property was absorbed in July of '82. She looked up. That's your neighbor, isn't it? Elena Fuentes. Elias stared at her. She told me last spring she was behind on payments, but Holt had extended grace to her. His voice had something in it that wasn't quite anger, something older than anger, colder. She's been paying. She has receipts. The receipts won't match this ledger, Rose said. He accepts the payments, records them as defaulted, pockets the money. By the time he serves notice, the family's books look clean, but the bank's records say they owe a full balance. She closed the ledger. He's been doing this for 4 years. Elias stood. He was already thinking ahead. The federal circuit judge, Judge Whitmore, not Carver. He holds session in Durango in 9 days, Rose said. If we can get this ledger and the sworn statements from Doc Harmon and Dolores to Durango before Whitmore leaves. I know a man in Durango, Elias said. He sent the wire before 7 that morning through the stage line office. Mercer Tillman, who ran it, had no debts to Fletcher Holt and agreed without hesitation. One wire to a former Army captain named James Briggs, now 6 years a deputy federal marshal. A second wire to the territorial governor's office in Santa Fe, drafted by Rose in 3 precise paragraphs that contained every relevant name, date, and number. Then Elias went to Sheriff Douglas Pratt's office. He laid the ledger on Pratt's desk without a word and let it speak for itself. Pratt looked at it for a long time. He didn't touch it at first, just looked at it, with the expression of a man who has been carrying something unbearably heavy and has just been offered the option of setting it down, and who is trying to calculate whether that relief will cost him more than the weight already has. Doc Harmon came in 5 minutes later, at Elias's prior request. He laid his written records of Rose's injuries on top of the ledger and said to Pratt, in the flat, honest voice of a man who has seen what the absence of justice produces in human bodies. Doug, you've been a decent man under bad circumstances. Don't let it end the other way around. Pratt looked at the ledger. He looked at Elias. He stood up. He buckled on his gun belt. I'll need to deputize you, he said. Gladly, Elias said. They went to the cross-stage at 8 in the morning. Pratt and Elias and Doc Harmon and 3 of Pratt's own deputies who had apparently been making their own quiet calculations about the nature of their loyalties. Fletcher Holt was already there, a lawyer at his side, fully informed, fully prepared. The lawyer looked at the assembled party. He looked at the ledger. He looked at his client. Fletcher Holt stood on the porch of his magnificent ranch house. 12,000 acres of stolen prosperity spread behind him, and for the first time that practiced smile failed. Not dramatically, not in the theatrical collapse of men in dime novels. It failed the way a candle fails when a door opens, a small, involuntary surrender to a change in the air. He was arrested without violence. James Briggs arrived from Durango 4 days later with a federal warrant. The trial was held in Santa Fe the following spring. It lasted 11 days. Rose Calloway's testimony, organized with the precision of a former court recorder who had spent 3 weeks inside the evidence, was described by the presiding judge as among the most compelling documentary presentations he had encountered in 20 years on the bench. Fletcher Holt was convicted on 7 counts of mortgage fraud, 2 counts of theft, and 1 count of conspiracy in the death of Miriam Holt. He received 22 years at the territorial prison in Yuma. The 9 families received formal judgments restoring their land titles. Elias drove out to tell Elena Fuentes himself on a cold December afternoon. He watched her read the paper twice, then a third time, then look up at him with the expression of a woman who has been right about something for 3 years and is only now finding out that being right was going to matter. He sat with her for 2 hours, drank coffee, didn't talk about much. It was one of the best afternoons he could remember. Rose Calloway stayed through the winter. This was not the plan. The plan had been Santa Fe or Albuquerque or perhaps somewhere entirely new. She had always been a woman in motion, drawn toward injustice the way some people are drawn toward water or elevation. But she stayed. She told herself it was practical. The trial required her return. The federal court had formally engaged her as legal recorder, and the town's finances needed someone honest to untangle them now that the savings and loan was in a court administrator's hands. These things were all true. They were not the whole truth. The whole truth had something to do with the way a certain rancher had stood on his porch against 3 armed men without once raising his voice. The way he'd knelt in hay at 2 in the morning and cleaned her wounds without asking why someone had put them there. The way he'd sat across a kitchen table and said, without drama or decoration, "I'm not in the business of watching that happen to people if I can do something about it," as if justice were not an ideal to be admired from a distance but a practical matter to be attended to, like a fence or a fire or anything else that requires honest tending. She stayed. She took a room at the hotel. By February, she had moved into a small house on the north side of town. They had dinner on Tuesday evenings. He showed her his land in the spring, when the desert came alive in its brief, explosive way. Ocotillo blazing red against the high blue sky, the ground furred green with grass that wouldn't last past June, the air carrying sage and wet stone after the first rains. He stood beside her on the high ground before the Red Rock Ridge and watched her look at it with the expression of a person recognizing something they hadn't known they were looking for. "This is why you stayed," she said. "Part of why," he said. She looked at him. He wasn't a man given to elaborate declarations. But she had learned that what he did say, he meant entirely, and that his silences were not empty. They were full of things he was still working up to saying, quietly, in his own time, in the way honest men in hard country take longer to speak because they want to be certain before they do. The spring wind moved through the sage. The cattle moved below on the flat ground. The mountains stood in the distance, doing what mountains have always done, enduring, witnessing, holding the stories of the people who passed through their shadow without asking to be thanked for it. 2 years later, a second photograph joined Clara's on the mantel. A man and a woman on a leaning porch, squinting into the sun, in front of a Red Rock Ridge in New Mexico territory, his hat still on, her dark hair loose, her hand on his arm with the specific grip of someone who has held on through hard things and intends to keep holding. Both of them smiling. It was not a legend. It was not a saga. It was just 2 people who had come through something difficult together and decided, quietly, stubbornly, honestly, to come through whatever followed together as well. Which is, when you consider it plainly, exactly what the best endings are. The snow that fell on that November night melted by December. The land it covered remained. The families went home. And whenever people in Harlan's Crossing told the story, and they did tell it for years, over store counters and at the Silver King and in the small church with the twice-weekly services, they always began the same way. There was a rancher, and he found a woman in his barn, and they always ended the same way too, and he let her in.